feels like, when you try to get a handle on the security situation there, it's less like looking at a clear map and more like trying to predict a really complex weather system.
Right.
You know what I mean? What we thought were solid borders, strong alliances, everything just feels a little bit more uncertain these days. So that sort of instability, that feeling of things being in flux, what does that actually tell us about where the world is headed?
Right. And you've brought like a really interesting collection of sources, everything from that, that draft treaty that Russia sent to the U.S. back in December 2021.
Right.
And we've also got analyses that track how, European security has been changing in the time since then. So the goal is to really take all of that, break it down, and then come away with a clear picture of what's really going on. What are the driving forces?
Exactly. Think of this as your cheat sheet to understanding like the core issues and the potential paths that European security might take. And of course, we're going to be focusing on the major players, Russia, NATO, and all the interesting stuff happening within Europe itself. So why don't we just jump right in? That Russian draft treaty, end of 2021. What were the main things that Russia was asking for?
What really stands out about that document is how upfront Russia was about what they see as unacceptable, their red lines. So first they suggested this mutual restriction where neither Russia nor NATO would station troops or weapons near each other's borders if it created a sense of threat. But, and this is important, this didn't apply within their own territories.
Oh, wow.
So Russia would have free reign within its borders, but wanted to limit what NATO and their neighbors could do.
So basically like a, not in my backyard, but my backyard is really big kind of approach. What else did they want?
Well, second, that draft was aiming to make this even bigger buffer zone, by limiting how close bombers and warships could get to each other's territory if they could potentially launch an attack. It was like enforcing this greater standoff distance. But I think the most crucial point was their demand for a total stop to NATO expanding further east. Like, this is something that Russia's been deeply concerned about for a very long time.
It's like Russia was trying to rewrite the whole security order in Europe that emerged after the Cold War. Looking at the European side of things, especially in the north, you can see that NB8 plus Poland group becoming more united. What makes this so important? It's more than just them being worried, right?
If we consider it alongside Russia's demands, I think what the Nordic and Baltic states, plus Poland, are doing shows how countries most exposed to Russia are responding proactively, focused on security. They're not just voicing concerns, they're using their combined influence in NATO and the EU to push for concrete security measures and coordinate their own defenses better. Like, imagine them having a much stronger unified voice when they want NATO to have a bigger presence or put in place certain deterrents in the region. That's what this is about.
It makes sense. And then we've got the British-led Joint Expeditionary.
So what's your first take on this? I mean, how much of this have they understood you correctly?
They have actually understood everything, and I'm really impressed. It is very well presented.
Yeah, it's Google language model that has gone through this. So would you like to add something on this first slides?
No, I think that they got the most important point. While it's not expressed in clear words, it's truly the fact that they want the West to withdraw from Russian borders as far away as possible, whereas they had no demands on themselves.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So that's the whole point. What is also underlying, which they didn't mention, but it's not clearly expressed either, is that this is really designed for a new world order where the major powers are deciding and the smaller powers, which means, for example, the Nordic countries, we are part of their special interest area. So we are to obey and the others are to decide. And there you can also see in the policies of Russia how he's treating the major countries with much more respect than he is treating the smaller countries. So this is truly their view and hopes and plans for the future.
Michael?
Yeah, I think that listening to this is a reminder how this ultimatum and the ideas inherent in those December 21, how it gave rise to the full counterproductivity effect, such that so many other things, the points that was asked for in that ultimatum, then led to the contrary, to Sweden and Finland joining NATO, etc., and the not 1 millimeter strategy to strengthen the eastern border, etc. All the things that they try to avoid, which is interesting in itself. And now it's also so interesting that Donald Trump somehow seeks to accommodate some of the wishes expressed at that time by Russia. So we are we're rounding the circle in a way.
Okay, so let's go on.
Yeah.
Force, or JEF. How does this fit into all of this, operating sort of outside that formal NATO structure?
What makes the JEF really interesting is how quickly it can be deployed to Northern Europe if there's a crisis. Especially because NATO's command structure often relies on consensus, which takes time, it's multinational, led by the UK, and shows how committed those countries are to protecting their shared interests in the region, basically complementing what NATO can do.
So like a rapid response team with a really specific area of focus. Makes sense. Now, we've got Sweden, which has been historically neutral, but they've been really stepping up their military activities, particularly in the Baltic region. They're present in Finland, Latvia, and they're even patrolling Polish airspace. It's a pretty big change for them, isn't it?
It is. It's a huge shift from their traditional neutrality. Sweden's more active in the military sphere in these neighboring countries, which shows that they're fully aware of the heightened security risks, and that they are willing to play their part in ensuring stability. When they talk about having an advanced presence in Latvia, it suggests something more substantial, beyond just making a symbolic gesture. And when they conduct those joint air patrols with Poland, a major NATO ally, it's a very real sign of solidarity, a clear message that they are prepared to work together.
And beyond those deployments, Sweden is also crucial to that EU plus NATO mobility project as a transit country. What's the advantage of that project strategically?
That mobility project is all about making sure that troops and military equipment can be moved quickly across Europe, and that's essential. And because of where Sweden is geographically, it becomes this vital route for getting Western support to the Baltic region and possibly further east. They're making real investments to streamline these transit routes, showing how seriously they take this. It's like they understand that being able to move forces quickly is in itself a major deterrent.
So it seems like Northern Europe is really tightening up its security measures in response to what they see as threats from Russia. Now, let's consider the countries in Europe that aren't in NATO but are right.
Before we continue on that, maybe Gunilla, you want to add something on this point?
Not add, but underline this effect that the Sweden joining NATO has had in the north is tremendous, and I don't think we really could foresee what an impact it would have, because now we are united, all of us, all 8, in the same organization, and suddenly it makes a huge difference, also because of the fact that we have exactly the same views, and that Poland came along. It came along in the meeting in Sweden in November 2024, when Sweden had been in NATO for only half a year, and expressed it clearly that together we are extremely strong. We are like a fist, said Donald Tusk, towards those who have bad intentions against us. And this is also how people describe it in other parts of Europe, that the northern and the northeast in particular has become a core of common views and of strength and of, that's about it. The Joint Expeditionary Force is not a new thing, but it's new in the very strong emphasis it puts on the north and on the Baltic Sea, so that's why they are included. The Swedish military presence in Finland, Latvia, Poland. This is maybe not what we thought about immediately when joining, but very soon afterwards, I would say. We are not the frontline state, and our whole policy has changed from when we were non-aligned. We will be elsewhere, and as the head of the Swedish army said, very few of the Swedish soldiers will be in Sweden. We will be at the front line, Finland, Baltic countries, etc. And the last point is interesting because it underlines the civilian component, how important it is to have civilian capability and military capability joining forces, because we can't be without any of them.
Yeah. Great. Michael, anything?
My little addition to this underlining things as well would be to say that, of course, this whole orientation of the Swedish defense and the Nordic joint defense and the combined North European defense structure raises the question of sufficiency compared to what the Russians, as the potential aggressor, might have. And then we have the timeline question and the question of balance is there, and the risk that if we put too much weight rhetorically and then politically onto the self-defense of Northern Europe as distinct from the full NATO force, we might end up in the classical problem of when we talk about Nordic-Baltic, for example, that don't fall into the trap of being alone in defense and in defense of Northern Europe. So that's one thing. And then, of course, since we are now members of NATO, we and Finland, we may count on isolated attack, as we used to plan to before, is not really in the cards. An attack on wherever means that we are involved in a full war against NATO. We have to see it this way, and therefore, to a large extent, in combining these factors, we have to look upon very much Baltic states as the relevant defense line of Sweden as well. And that has huge implications. So just underlining these
But
points.
just pick out one word that you mentioned there, Michael, time. The time factor is crucial here.
Yeah.
I mean, we cannot allow a massive destruction of Baltic states, which could come from a surprise attack with artillery. I had this discussion in the Defense University yesterday, and there was still not full agreement on the fact that it may be that NATO is superior to Russia totally, but it's all a matter of time and preparedness. It's all a matter of being and having a real functioning deterrence. I will come back to that. Can we go to the next one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right next to Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, the sources seem pretty worried about them.
Yeah, they're described as being right on the front lines, actually fighting against Russia and for their survival. And it's really telling that they're all EU candidate states, which shows that they've made this choice to align themselves with the West to enhance their security and sovereignty. Of course, we have Ukraine, which is tragically dealing with a full-scale Russian invasion. Georgia, as the source notes, has a pro-Russian government that came to power after an election that was, let's say, controversial, which raises some serious questions about where they stand geopolitically. And then there's Moldova, which, despite having a pro-Western president, is still incredibly vulnerable to Russian meddling.
And when you look at it this way, the possibility of the EU expanding to include these countries becomes, the source describes it as difficult, dangerous, and necessary. So let's look at each of those. Why is it difficult?
It's difficult because these countries often have significant internal hurdles to overcome before they can meet the EU's pretty strict criteria for membership. Things like fighting corruption, strengthening the rule of law, and making sure their economies are stable. These aren't quick fixes. They require time, resources, and real political willpower.
And dangerous.
Well, as we've seen with how Russia has acted in Ukraine and how they're interfering in other places, any move by these countries that seems like they're leaning toward the West is likely to provoke a strong reaction from Moscow, maybe even something destabilizing. Enlargement could be seen as a direct threat to Russia's sphere of influence.
And lastly, necessary.
It's considered necessary because becoming part of the EU gives these countries a vital connection to the West. It provides a structure for political, economic, and maybe even security cooperation. And that can help counter Russian influence and support their democratic progress. It's a way to solidify their sovereignty and create long-term stability in a very unstable region.
So it sounds like everyone's making these high stakes calculations. Okay, let's shift to the United States. This
So before again moving on, let's hear Gunilla. Do you want to underline or add, or maybe change? I mean,
no, absolutely not change. No. But I think this is an important picture because this is something that is well understood in Europe. And when it comes to the US administration, I don't think it is understood at all because the Russian motives are not understood in the United States. I find it very hard to believe that President Trump would act the way he does if he understood that the United States, that Russia is also after the whole Western world, changing our way of living, rules of law, etc. He believes it's about Ukraine, but
Okay.
it isn't. So,
okay, let's come back to the US under the next slide.
okay, but I want to underline that this is very much the core of what the Europeans are doing.
Yeah.
Because we are alone here. This is the point. So the three countries are all fighting against Russia, but with different means. Georgia did not succeed, unfortunately, because the Russians are very good at destroying a country without using military means, how to distort the results of election, for example, etc., etc. Moldova succeeded in its presidential election because of the diaspora, mainly. But the Russians did what they could to undermine there as well. But they are extremely fragile.
Yeah.
Moldova, especially because they are still independent. So the thing now is that while all three of them are candidate states, Georgia, because of its Russian-dominated government, is not allowed to be part of the negotiations, unfortunately, which they are extremely unhappy about, of course. So let's hope. And the decision about the enlargement did not come easy for the European Union. Everyone understands the three factors that I wrote down there, how difficult, dangerous, and necessary these are. I'm very happy to see that Sweden is pushing very much for this to go on as quickly and as well as possible. The EU has made one very important decision, which I find very good, and that is a stepwise integration, which is new to the enlargement process. Before, all the goodies from EU membership came on the day when countries became members. Now they will get the benefits when each chapter, as they are called, are finished. Also, they will hopefully be changing the rules for how to bring in the countries. France, at a time, was very negative towards EU enlargement and managed to introduce some very difficult rules for the countries, but these rules are not part of the EU treaty, so they can be changed, and I believe they will be changed because France has changed. But of course, the ideal would also be membership of NATO, and that is, as things stand now, not possible. But EU is very good as well. The EU is also continually difficult to uphold their presence, their membership, because what Russia will try to do is that even after they have been accepted, they will try to undermine it. And you could look like an EU member, like a window where Russians can look in through the window and see what things are like in a country that is ruled in democracy, market economy, etc. And it will be a constant provocation to Russia to see these countries within the EU. So even if it's necessary, and we should be extremely happy when they are there, this is not the end of it.
No. Michael?
Well, so much to say about this. There is a discussion, a discourse now about which is faster, EU enlargement or NATO enlargement. I have some views on that, but leaving that aside as a discussion, assuming that now that the US has stated so clearly that NATO for Ukraine is not in the cards, then that reminds me at least that when there were discussions in Istanbul in 22 about the possible agreement concerning Ukraine, the question of the issue of EU membership came in as a potentially sort of constructive component at that time. So I too think that the EU enlargement should be the path to walk. We have seen in the Western Balkans how difficult it can be for the EU countries to agree when it comes to the nitty-gritty of enlargement negotiations. I'm a little bit worried there that there will be very, very, concerning the point difficulty. I have some experience in EU enlargement in the Western Balkans, so I'm afraid that it's going to be difficult. But as people are saying about the Palestinian issue, it is impossible to think about having a Palestinian state, but it is necessary. This ambiguity about things is somehow comparable, I think.
Yeah.
I'm stressing the difficulty, but the necessity in what I'm saying.
Are we ready to go on, Gunilla?
Yes.
So I want to introduce the next discussion with a more general comment. Yesterday, when I was discussing with people in Defense University, I had the opportunity to say that we focus in our project quite a lot on domestic politics because we find, to our perhaps partial surprise, but not totally, that you may think that even at least big powers would act according to their national interest, but we see enormous lack of continuity in the policies of even such a big country as the United States. And that's the next, and it is not the only one. We also have had crucial, brinkmanship in countries like Poland, France, with Le Pen, and now Germany, of course, with the elections. So one cannot just explain what countries are doing, looking at so to say, some sort of abstract gaming-based national interest analysis. That's why Gunilla's work is so important in this project, because to understand the wide scope of possible action and the divergences that we can see here. So let's move on with the
Sources highlight some shifts in American policy that are, to be honest, a little confusing, even contradictory. What are some of the big changes that are being reported?
This is where things get really tricky. We're seeing reports of the U.S. putting tariffs in place based on what are described as untrue figures, which obviously can strain relationships with allies. There's also this mention of pressure being put on Canada and Denmark. I don't have specifics, but it suggests there's some friction within these alliances. And then, more worryingly, there are reports that the U.S. has been repeating things that Russia has said about Ukraine, even though these claims have been widely debunked, like questioning whether President Zelensky is a legitimate leader and pushing for elections while there's a war going on.
Wow, that's a pretty big change from what most of the West believes. The source even hints that some of what the U.S. is doing might actually be helping Russia. They bring up the closure of Radio Free Europe as an example. Can you explain how that might be the case?
Well, the argument is that Radio Free Europe has always been a crucial source of unbiased information in places where the media is controlled by the government, including areas where Russia has influence. If it's shut down, then there's a chance that people won't have access to different points of view, and Russian propaganda might have free rein in some places.
Yeah, that's not great. And alongside all of this, the source mentions that the level of support the U.S. is giving to countries like Ukraine seems to be changing. What kind of changes are we talking about?
The details are a bit vague, but it seems like there might be some rethinking going on about how much and what kind of aid the U.S. will provide. And this could have a huge impact on Ukraine's ability to defend itself and the broader geopolitical balance.
It does seem like there's quite a bit of uncertainty, maybe even some disagreement on how to approach things across the Atlantic. Now, what about the European Union? What can they actually...
Let's stop there again, and before we move on, obviously we haven't informed AI totally about what has actually happened. So you might want to fill in the blank here a little bit, Gunilla.
Yeah, there has been some interesting discussions and attempts in Europe to find out what kind of background there is for the figures like the 39% of tariffs and other things that the EU is imposing on United States right now, and I think they have succeeded in coming up with the explanation, which all economists say are highly strange because they are not related to tariffs at all. And this may be typical for many of the things that Donald Trump says now related to the tariffs. Apparently, he has for a long time said that he loves tariffs, and it is a good way of making United States very rich again. So I think this seems to be the main motive for introducing them. And on top of that, of course, he is adding a lot of facts that are simply not facts. And this is what Europe is taking a stand on now, first trying to negotiate. And I heard him say this morning, actually words that I don't want to repeat, they are too ugly, but he is really extremely happy about the fact that others are in distress right now and expresses his joy about this. But the EU will, if the discussions are not successful, they will, of course, start using their own response in terms of similar tariffs on the United States. Pressuring alliance members, well, there we have Canada. He wants to bring in Canada as number 50, or the state that will be number 51. We have the tariffs, we have other things, and with Denmark, of course, it's Greenland, which is very strange because the main argument is that Denmark is not up to its obligations when it comes to securing Greenland. But as the agreement of 1959 says, it's the United States that is to do this, and they at that time had 17 bases, now they have one base, and blaming Denmark for the lack of defense is a very strange thing to do in a country with only 5 million people. What most people think is that it's all about the rare earth minerals, but this is not actually spelled out. What is the sad thing here, of course, is that both Canada and Denmark are NATO states. So it says a lot about how Donald Trump thinks about how one could behave within NATO and still have NATO working as he claims it is. Repeat known Russian falsehoods. Well, there are many things apart from Zelensky being a dictator. Elections are necessary. Elections are impossible when there is a war because the soldiers would have to go home to cast their ballots, saying that Ukraine actually started the war. There are really stupid things. I think the saddest thing about this was the vote in the United Nations, where Russia, North Korea, and United States were on the same line, refusing to condemn the war, the attack against Ukraine. This shows a lot.
Yeah.
Introduce measures to benefit Russia with a Radio Free Europe, of course. There are other measures as well. And I think this comes together with the last point, the way he has behaved against Ukraine, seeking an agreement that enriches the United States while giving nothing to Ukraine. I think that is a very, very sad thing to see, actually.
Good. Michael?
Just to underline then from my side the enormous implications of the combined effects of, on the one hand, all the things that have been said from the US side about, well, the points that Gunilla just raised, Denmark, Canada, etc., and the information yesterday about possibly withdrawing 10,000 troops from among the 20,000 increases in troops that Biden introduced in response to the Russian aggression. And now the beginnings of a trade war, action, reaction, tit for tat. What does the combined effects of all this do to the transatlantic relations as a whole? I think also that it's so interesting to see how Canada will operate in this. I mean, it's after all on the other side of the Atlantic, but still clearly on the side of Europe. So the questions of how far will it go? What are the factors that could restrain a general tendency towards putting in question the whole thing, and then still having the preparation process for the NATO summit in June going on? It's full of potentials in various different directions, developments generally.
And you have the self-inflicted wounds now, throwing away soft power that has been established through diligent work over decades since the Second World War. All the goodwill that is being lost, the description of the entire world as an enemy, more or less. So that's with the significant exception of Russia. So it's very, very sad. Shall we go on, Gunilla?
Yeah. No, I just want to add that I agree very much with Mikael's points, and it's very worrying to see that the United States at times speak about reduction of their own how much they will give to defense. They speak about cutting down on their own defense budget.
Well, I'm of course very happy that you agree with Michael, but let's go on.
Okay. I get
We do in response to this evolving security crisis.
The EU has a few important tools it can use. First, there are sanctions. But we all know that to impose sanctions, all the member states have to agree, which can be tricky sometimes, especially if they want to make the sanctions stronger or expand them. The source does mention that the 17th round of sanctions was adopted in March. Second, they can give financial aid. This can be done collectively through EU channels or by individual countries, which gives them some flexibility.
Right. And then there's the European Commission's plan to increase defense spending. Can you give us some of the numbers and the reasoning behind it?
The European Commission has put forward this big plan. It's something like 800 billion to make European defenses stronger. One part of it is to get all member states to increase their defense spending by an average of 1.5% of their GDP. The idea is that in this changing world, Europe needs to be more responsible for its own security, and that's a view that's becoming more common. This increased investment is meant to make national defenses better and encourage more cooperation on defense projects.
And then there's the issue of those frozen Russian assets, about 200 billion held in EU banks. That's still a major topic of debate, right? What's the latest on what might be done with them?
Those assets are still frozen under the EU sanctions. Right now, most of the discussions are about maybe using the profits generated from those assets instead of seizing the principal amount itself. It's legally and politically really complicated to use the principal, so the member states are still trying to figure out the best way to proceed.
So it's this careful dance of trying to be legally sound and politically smart. And in this world where alliances are changing and new threats keep popping up, we're also seeing new groups and initiatives forming in Europe. Take the European.
So we'll stop there for a second and get your filling in the blank comments here, Gunilla, on the...
Yeah, I'll enlarge a bit on the points. The way the EU has been handling Hungary here is, of course, very essential. About the sanctions, the EU included also among its proposals some sanctions that would actually also hit Hungary. And this is how they managed to negotiate away them and at the same time get Hungarian approval to them. And the financial contributions been given in an individual way that is more or less EU 26. This is also, of course, because of Hungary. The Commission plan is interesting because it came so quickly. It came only a few days after what shocked most countries, that is the meeting in the Oval Office, where, according to most Europeans who watched it, it was maybe not a plan, but actually it was a sad humiliation of President Zelensky. So let's hope this will work out. It will not be so easy. As you see, it requires a 1.5% increase. This is actually what NATO also demands. Right now, the NATO demands 2%, or it did, but recently it also increased it to 3.5%, which is also where Sweden is heading right now. So this is one of the necessities that it will not be easy for all countries in Europe. Some countries are in economic dire straits, but this is the ambition. There are other things that I haven't brought up here, but it will probably be possible to realize many of them, even if maybe not the whole of 800 euros. The frozen assets are extremely important. An increasing number of countries now saying that we should be able to take all of it, because we will anyway have to pay for the build-up of Ukraine, etc. So we will see what happens, but it's a small minority that still resists it, and Sweden is for taking it. Those who resist it, they usually say that this will make it very difficult for countries outside Europe to be sure that their money are safe in European banks, which is, of course, a valid argument. But what we have now is that we can take the yield. Everyone is for taking the yield. It was used, 50 billion we used last year for Ukraine.
Okay. And Michael, do you have anything on this?
Yeah, at the risk of saying something that Gunilla will agree to, and you will laugh at that for some odd reason. I would like to stress the time factor again, and I think that no one can dispute that this is an enormous effort led by the Commission in order to create the financial conditions for putting up a relevant defense against Russian aggression and other threats. Then in parallel, you have the coalition of the willing efforts led by UK and France. And I'm curious, Gunilla, when will Germany, under the new leadership there, the big coalition, join forces to be a sort of co-leader of that process? I for one don't have an answer to that. Maybe you have. But to stress that we have a time factor, how long will it take for these two processes somehow to coincide? And what is the timing in terms of when will it be resulting in present deterrence and also perhaps military presence in the implementation of a possible agreement of which we know nothing still at the moment. So there are huge uncertainties, and I'm looking forward to the next few years, wondering about timing and how assets will be translated into real military capabilities. So interesting to foresee.
The perennial problem has been, ever since I started in the EU in '96, has been, on the one hand, establishing the competence of the Commission, actually, the community policies to involve themselves in security at all. I mean, that has been something that has been consistently downgraded as a possibility also in Swedish defense policy. We have had endless number of statements by defense ministers over the years. No, the EU is not the important part here. It's all about the national policies and about NATO. The second problem that you mentioned, Michael, is also I have been allergic, I must say, over the years to hear commissioners speak in the future tense, because I never knew what that meant in terms of actual implementation. I had always to assume that they were talking about 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years down the road before you would see the actual implementation of programs.
If at all.
If
Yeah.
Gunilla?
Could I add one thing, which is common to what you said now, Lars-Erik, and highly interesting. I think that this plan from the Commission came on the 4th of March. 2 days later, we had a special European Council. And more or less the whole content of what the European Council decided was to accept the Commission's plan.
Which might then have been a bit pre-packaged or pre-negotiated.
Now you're destroying everything. No.
It might even have been written somewhere else. Who knows, you know.
I think we have a very strong leader of the Commission.
Yes.
I don't think she will let anyone really overrule her.
Yes.
We can continue to argue about that.
No, but joke aside, it's of course an extraordinary and already 10 years ago I found when studying the EU and security issue, I found the role of the European Council to be an extraordinary asset in EU external action, that they could take decisions so quickly and override bureaucratic counter arguments and legal services and so on. Michael, you had another point.
I just wanted to remind Gunilla of what I said as a question to you concerning Germany adding up to the grouping of leadership countries. But we're coming to this on the next slide, perhaps. So
we are coming to it now.
Yeah.
So that's why I didn't answer you. I will answer.
Okay.
So wait for it. Let's listen to the constructive AI voices here.
Political community, or EPC, what's the main idea behind it?
The EPC, which France came up with, is meant to be a big forum where all of Europe can discuss and cooperate on things. It has 47 member states. What's important is that it lets countries that aren't in the EU join the conversation about shared problems like security, energy, and the economy. It creates a wider sense of shared security and interests.
And then there's this group that's been called the SEX, or sometimes Weimar plus Verbe. Who are the key players, and what's the purpose of this group?
This one's a smaller, less formal group. It's got France, Germany, Poland, the UK, Spain, and Italy. They've met a few times since November 2024, which tells me that these big European powers are serious about working together on the big strategic issues. When they use Weimar plus, it's probably a nod to the cooperation between France, Germany, and Poland, which has had its ups and downs, but now they're adding more key countries. It shows that they want to form this coalition of leading European nations to guide the continent's future.
We're also seeing a lot of talk about these coalitions of the willing. Why are these more ad hoc groups so important?
Coalitions of the willing are basically groups of countries that come together to deal with specific issues, often when things are urgent or when they want to provide targeted help in a particular area. The fact that they had a meeting in London in March shows that some countries are ready to take action and work together on things they agree on, even if they can't get everyone in the EU or NATO to agree right away.
Right now, a lot of the focus is on supporting Ukraine, which makes sense. The sources talk about a porcupine strategy to help strengthen Ukraine's defenses.
So let's stop there again and look at this slide.
Yeah. I find this way of dealing with problems very typical of the European Union at the moment. We have seen it before. We saw it even in the Balkans with a contact group joining the 5 most forceful countries in a very constructive way, which finally created an end to the hostilities there. But we see it now very much in the very diverse problems that Europe is meeting. And starting from the top, the European Policy Community was established a few years ago by France. And this was not the first attempt to bring the UK into a group with the EU members without calling it anything that might remind the British about the fact that they were not there. Actually, at the first meeting, by mistake, there was an EU flag, which the British reminded the others that they had to take down. But the EU policy community became very successful, also in the sense that the British appreciated very much there were problems they could solve, which had not been possible to solve after they left the EU. When they met in November 2024, they formed an internal group, which was the six: France, Germany, Poland, UK, Spain, and Italy. And as is said in the comments, these are the largest countries in Europe in terms of GDP. And the idea was to deal with what they knew would be demands for new tariffs. And at the next meeting, which was in Warsaw, it was about Ukraine. And they came up with some very strong statements, and some of them are now part of the Commission proposal, taking up new loans for the EU, etc. And it has worked very well between them. They have agreed, and when you see the list, these are countries that are really very different, but they are united in this. Weimar plus, that means just to say it in shorter, Weimar is France, Germany, and Poland, which have been agreeing on a number of things when the discussions between France and Germany have not gone very well. It has been very useful to have Poland as the third component there. Coalitions of the willing, that's another way of dealing with the same problem. This is only about helping Ukraine militarily. So the countries that were invited to the London meeting on March 2, this is 2 days after the meeting in the Oval Office. That was the countries that had some military capability. The Baltic countries were unhappy that they were not invited, but that simply had to do with the fact that their military capabilities is very low. There were 19. And this has worked. And then I realized afterwards that I should have added what Mikael is talking about, the leadership of France and UK. And I have noted that Friedrich Merz is not altogether happy that those two only are there. I think the reason is that at the time, and still, Germany does not have a government. They maybe will get one today, I don't know, but there is hope now. But France and the UK have together taken a number of initiatives these last months. And other countries generally see them as two very important countries where Germany simply can't compete because it has to do with military issues. The fact that France and Germany, their representatives, last week went together to Kiev is symbolic because they were talking about the military issues, and this is where Germany is weak, very weak, both in its military forces but primarily in its military policy. Not only during Scholz but continually after the Second World War. These issues have been very difficult for Germany. So on your question, Mikael, I would say that Germany will play a very important role in Europe, and especially if they get a government that will be united and will be able to mend what needs to be mended, but they will never be a strong country when it comes to military issues simply because they can't. But they will be politically due to their size and to their hopefully strong economy. That's it.
Let's see on that. Michael, do you want to comment?
Yeah, two points. One would be that you might have added also the Rammstein format of actors joining in formerly under U.S. leadership, and then preemptively that was changed before the U.S. elections, and then now it's led differently. I don't really see how that format combines to the existing other ones, especially the coalition of the willing. Maybe you have a comment on that, Gunilla, as well. I agree with what you say. I raised the question of Germany because I think that Germany will be not just financially, because it is, after all, once the big coalition comes into fruition and formation anytime soon now, it will have a program of a dramatic increase in its defense capability. It will still somehow be prevented from utilizing it. I agree with that, also because of historical reasons, but there is inherited from the past that somehow is a prevention from Germany to be perceived to be too strong. But there is still Poland then, being the neighbor. So I see a lot of dynamism here. I'm still worried about the time factor and how long time all this will work out in and become something, so to speak, useful in terms of deterrence. My sense is, I heard what you said, Gunilla, about the European policy community. You said it has been a success. I wonder what you meant by success. My sense is that precisely because of the domestic policy reasons, there will always be new initiatives in various combinations of countries. There is a risk of fragmentation into all this, even though you might say that each initiative is useful in itself, but the sum total and over time could be problematic as well. So that's my addition.
I have a general point on the EPC that may be of interest. When we are discussing the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act, Michael and I, we have written each one chapter in the book that commemorates that. We have been discussing what is most important. Is it the principles and the commitments, or is it the organization as such? And I want to highlight that because here we have EPC, which does not, as far as I remember, include the Central Asian states. It doesn't include the United States. It doesn't include Russia. Doesn't include Belarus, etc. So we don't know. Is this a format that will take over, to which Belarus and Russia and other countries would have to apply to become members of, like we did with the OSCE when Serbia was excluded from the organization in the early 90s and had to wait almost 10 years before coming back into the heat. So I just mentioned one has to be open for various possible constellations here, and as Michael just said, there will be a considerable amount of creativity here, I think, where we can expect perhaps also surprises. Gunilla, do you have anything more on this one?
Oh, yes, I have three questions. EPC, Mikael said, what are the successes? The successes have been a number of issues for the UK, where they wanted to agree with other countries. Migration, I think, was brought up, but several other things that are usually discussed within the EU and where the UK wanted to come along and be part of the discussions, more or less. Maybe some of the agreements too, but it led to agreements. even if they were not formal in that sense. So they are happy, and that's why they had the meeting of last year in the UK at London Palace. Absolutely, EPC is something that is shaped for one specific purpose and at a specific time. It may very well change, or then something else can come up with another name, because that's the whole idea between these idea that the need creates the group. Rammstein, I think Rammstein is something that may be taken over by European NATO countries plus Canada. This is what some people say should be the good development. About Poland, we don't hear so much about Poland now, and I think this, in spite of it being the leader of the EU, I think the reason is that Poland has said that it has no possibility to participate with the forces in Ukraine. So in the various ideas that are launched, Poland will play a rather small group. But Poland is very active in what I come to soon, which is development of forces in Europe.
And they have presidential elections coming up.
Yeah, that will be tough. Yeah.